Thanks, Laura. My name's Chris, and I'm one of the authors of this book, and professor at the university. And I'm really just going to introduce tonight and tell you a bit of the story behind why we're here and why this book exists. I'll go and grab the book, actually.
We need a prop.
So it's a really wonderful occasion to be able to talk publicly about the background to this book and the story that goes behind it. So for people who don't know me in the room, I'm a professor in the geography department at the university, and I had a very serious research project got funded a few years ago, and it was about what kind of cultural assets are there in this region that we can use to help think about future industrial growth and so on. And I had this PhD student that I recruited, Andrew Warren, and he did some field work on a couple of different case studies, and it was all good, it was looking good. And then Andrew came into my office one day and said, I've got an idea. It might be a bit out there, so, bear with me. I think I should do my PhD on surfboards. And I went, what? This is supposed to be a serious project, And anyway, he sat me down and he told me a little story, which I think he might share with you in a minute, about his local board maker and some of the issues affecting the industry of surfboard making. And I thought, you know what, this is actually a really good story. All right, as a supervisor of your PhD, all right, then I'll let you go away and explore that a little bit. Anyway, it became a huge journey of discovery for Andrew and for myself. One thing led to another. Andrew ended up doing field work, starting out talking to local board makers here in the Illawarra. We started, there's a bit of history here we need to know about. We need to probably go a bit deeper than this and talk to some older guys who set this industry up. And Andrew went and did some of that. I joined him on some of those conversations, and out came the shoe boxes with photographs back from the 50s and 60s. One thing led to another. I thought, why don't we go to Hawaii and figure out where it all began? So, that's a good idea. We've got a conference coming up in America. Can we go for it? Yeah, we can. We can go for it. Let's do it. Where's the conference? Los Angeles. Oh, I think they've surfed there before. Yeah, okay. Let's go to Southern California and do some stuff there. Anyway, one thing led to another, and it became one of those really just why not kind of experiences, really, where one thing, what really was just a chance suggestion in an office here at Wollongong Uni a few years ago became something very much bigger than what we ever imagined it would be, and it took on a life of its own. So Andrew, more than me, but I've joined him on some of these trips, have spent the last few years tripping across the Pacific and up and down the east coast of Australia, talking to surfers, talking to surfboard makers, talking to people who established the surfing industry in Australia. Towards the end of his PhD, by that stage I knew, this is a pretty good story. This is cool. I thought, let's just follow this preposterous idea through to its logical conclusion. Let's approach an American publisher and say, we should write a book about this. Yeah, let's do that. Why not? So we fired off an email that afternoon to a big publisher based in Hawaii, academic publisher, and they loved it. They thought, yeah, this is great. Let's do it. And so after Andrew had finished his PhD with all the sort of highfalutin language and serious stuff there, and justify the PhD, we took the field work that he'd done, went back to Hawaii, someone had to do it, and turned that into a book and explored more of the history and the craft, the people, if you like, behind surfing and behind the surfing industry. And that is what led to this book, which came out not too long ago. And it's one of those things as an academic, you write project proposals, you get grants, you plan to write publications, and it can be very ordered and very sequential, and you can plan it to the nth degree, and then sometimes you get a curiosity comes along, a quirky idea, and you've just got to actually follow it and see what happens and see what comes of it. And this book is a classic example of that. We never really planned to do something like this, so ambitious as this. But it's really wonderful to see it in existence. So what you're going to hear tonight are some stories about characters that are in the book. You're going to hear a little bit of a story about the research that Andrew primarily did leading to this book, and you're going to meet at least one of the characters who's in the book, Richard Harvey from the Gold Coast, who's here with us tonight, a legendary board maker and surfer, profiled in the book, who's flown down from the Gold Coast to be with us tonight. So we'll have a little bit of a bit of a tour through history, a bit of a nostalgic journey back to the early days of surfing and how it evolved as an industry. And then we'll invite Richard up here onto the stage to have a bit of an interview with Andrew, and there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers and those sorts of things as well. We are flogging copies of the book. We ordered a box of these from Hawaii, and we're just going to sell these tonight for $20, I think, at cost, so we don't want to make any money out of them. We've got a limited supply of those over there, and we've got a cash card thingy, a FPOS machine. So if you're interested in the book, there are copies of those available for you to buy this evening. But without further ado, I will hand over to Andrew, who can tell you a little bit about, I guess, his PhD and the story of surfing, surfboard making, and a bit of a trip down memory lane.
Memory lane, sounds good. I might as well use this, I think. Okay, so Chris, I guess, mentioned a little bit of the background story to how I started to look at surfboard making, surfboard manufacturing. And it really evolved from conversations that I was having with the person that was making my boards, or the workshop that was making my surfboards. I'm a surfer from the Shellharbour area, and I've surfed most of my life. And I would go in on a Friday afternoon and I would have these interesting conversations with Mick Carabine at Carabine Surf Designs in Flinders Street. And Mick would basically tell me about local surf history and local surf culture and these fantastic stories about his own travels around the world, but also about how he had made a living from making surfboards, particularly glassing surfboards. And I'd had several boards made from Mick, and then one afternoon Mick got to talking, it's a shame he's not here actually to share this, but he got to talking about his retirement. He'd been working for more than 40 years, doing something that he was very passionate about, but he felt as though it was time that he retired. And I asked him, I said, well, who's going to glass my boards, Mick? I'm really worried here that I'm going to have to go elsewhere to get my next board. And he said, well, you know, I hadn't really thought much about succession planning or to pass on a lot of my skills and even the business. His sort of thinking was that he would walk away, he'd close the door and he'd retire happily down the coast, which was fantastic. But I said, you know, you should really pass on this skill and knowledge, and hopefully I'm sure someone out there would be interested in buying a viable little business and doing something that they were actually genuinely passionate about. And so that's really, from that conversation, sparked my own enthusiasm and interest in learning a little bit more about the surfboard making craft, how the industry operated, where it had come from as well, so that sort of historical background to surfboard making. And it turns out that story was actually quite rich in terms of people's personal stories, but also rich in terms of telling quite an interesting story about coastal life along Australia's east coast and in other parts of the world as well, where people had genuinely chased something that they were passionate about and had found a way of turning that interest into a lifestyle and into a livelihood. And so I thought that was something that was scholarly enough to write a thesis on, but at the same time actually was a reflection on a wider set of issues that were going on within Australian society at the time around things like manufacturing, around things like worker skill, and these sort of bigger political issues that I guess are bubbling to the surface at the moment. So I'll just quickly go through a little bit about the history, I guess, if you like, of surfboard making in Australia. So many of you might have heard of Duke Kahanamoku before, a very famous Hawaiian surfer and swimmer. Actually won several gold medals in the 100 metres swimming, freestyle swimming. Duke visited Australia. He arrived in Australia in December of 1914 and came over actually to provide a series of swimming exhibitions. So the New South Wales Amateur Swimming Club had brought him over. He was basically tasked with providing demonstrations in swimming, but also in life-saving techniques. And at the time, obviously it was known that the Duke was also a surfer from Hawaii. And some people asked why he hadn't actually brought a surfboard. And Duke had been told before he left Honolulu that actually surfboards were banned in Australia and he shouldn't bring one. He should leave his boards at home. So that actually was really quite serendipitous, because what it meant was that rather than bring boards with him, he actually had to make them locally. So he actually made an estimate of between 5 and 8 boards, mostly from sugar pine. Now there was some stand-up surfing that was occurring along Australia's eastern coast, particularly in the northern beaches of Sydney, prior to Duke's arrival from tourists that had visited Honolulu and actually brought a couple of boards back. But nonetheless, they weren't very successful at stand-up surfing in particular, and there wasn't much knowledge about how you would go about actually making your own board. So Duke is quite important in terms of the popularisation of stand-up surfing in Australia, but also equally very important in terms of passing on knowledge and the skill in actually making your own surfboard from timber, from scratch. And that's becomes obviously quite important. So some really nice, iconic historical photographs here that sort of demonstrate the impact that Duke had. So this one in particular, where you can sort of clearly see Duke standing up, surfing on a wave at Freshwater Beach. I love this photograph showing the transportation of Duke's board from Freshwater Beach back to his accommodation. Sorry? It is, yeah. 4 wheels and horse-drawn, of course. But no, so this is, I guess, the important role, I guess, that this Hawaiian waterman had played in promoting surfing in Australia, but also transferring on his knowledge about how to make a surfboard. That actually turns out to be quite important. What we then see in Australia is then that a number of surfers, and through this stage, surfing is obviously a fairly fledgling informal thing that's very closely attached with surf lifesaving clubs. So the vast majority of surfers did so around their surf lifesaving club commitments. And you also start to see that the way in which surfboards are made are very closely modelled on the plan forms really that Duke had showed other surfers. So you see a replication of Duke's designs actually right up until the 1930s or 1940s. So there's a good 2 to 3 decade period where his designs were essentially replicated for those people that wanted to make their own boards. So that's sort of the way in which surfing evolves, is this sort of informal friendship network. People that are interested in surfing are mostly part of surf lifesaving clubs. A lot of Australian surfers at this stage are making boards in a design that became known as toothpicks. So essentially quite long, up to 16 or 17 feet long, boards that actually didn't perform very well in the surf. It was very difficult to plane across a wave. It was very difficult to catch steep waves. So it generally meant that surfing, in some ways, performance at least, was quite restricted because of the lack of the availability of suitable materials and also suitable designs. So a photograph here, I guess, it shows what these toothpicks were like and how long they were. They're sitting on the roof of a combi here, but basically these surfers are pictured here at Torquay, and it turns out that this is quite an important event because in 1956, a group of American lifesavers, but also surfers themselves, actually visited Australia and brought with them a bunch of surfboards. And the surfboards that those Americans brought with them were made out of balsa wood, which was a much lighter and easier to work with in some cases material. And their boards were much more manoeuvrable than what Australian surfers had been using for the last 30 years or so. And so that material change, I guess, had a really significant impact on the future direction of Australian surfing, but also on surfboard making in particular. And so what we start to see then is the introduction of balsa wood, which in some cases dramatically changes the design of surfboards and how surfboards are made, but also surfing performance. So balsa wood turns out to be quite an important material change from using other sorts of quite heavy hardwood timbers. And so you can actually see that there's 2 toothpicks pictured in the background here from this photo on Kirra Beach in 1957. But these 4 gentlemen here in the front have their balsa wood boards, quite innovative at the time. And you can see on the right here a man named Scott Dillon, quite well-known Australian surfer, also surfboard maker, who actually opened one of the first commercial workshops in Australia. And Scott there is sort of finishing off a fiberglass balsa wood board. He had a workshop in Bondi. What we also did was actually want to trace back a little bit about the industrial history of surfboard making, so think about where it started from and under what sort of conditions. And prior to the mid-1950s, really, surfboard making was very much a DIY hobby. So surfboard making was a way in which you made something for yourself so that it enabled you to go and catch waves. There was a few people that were making boards in Australia and that were selling them to friends within social networks, but it wasn't essentially a profit-making enterprise. It was something that you did to make enough cash potentially to make another board. So this was a really interesting transition, I guess, that was occurring from the mid-1950s, where you had surfboard making moving from a backyard hobbyist activity increasingly into an explicitly commercial business. And so this picture here is from 1955 in Dana Point, California, the Hobie Alta workshop, which was the first sort of commercial workshop, surfboard workshop. Hobie's quite known for a bunch of other surf craft as well, including boats, or Hobie Cats, which is a very popular sailing boat. But essentially this was the first explicitly commercial surfboard workshop that looked to make a living, if you like, from surfboard making. There were a number of problems that I guess went along with that, one of which was the fact there wasn't really a very big market for surfboards. So while you were making surfboards and trying to make a living out of it, it meant that they were quite labour intensive, there wasn't really big profit margins to be made in surfboards, and because there wasn't really a mass market, it meant that many of the surfers that were attempting to move towards board making as a livelihood found it quite difficult. And that actually continues on until the early 1960s. A really interesting photograph here, this is of the Dylan Ward workshop in Bondi, and a really famous face. Can anyone tell me who that is?
To win a book.
To win a book. I'll give you a clue, a famous commentator.
Sports commentator.
Sports,
Channel 9.
Not Rex Mossop.
I've heard the correct
I've
answer.
heard the right answer, but we can't give it to the cameraman. No. Darryl Eastlake, that's correct. So, well done. I don't know if you ever commentated on surfing, but nonetheless, Darryl Eastlake hanging out at a Bondi workshop in the late 1950s. Once balsa wood comes into the Australian surfboard making scene, you then start to get an upsurge in a number of surfers that try to make a living from their board making. And one of the early ones was Scott Dillon, but there was also a number of others, Barry Bennett, Gordon Woods, Denny Keogh, Greg McDonough. So there was a number of board makers that attempted to make a living. And a lot of these were based in Brookvale, a light industrial estate on the northern beaches of Sydney. And that actually became known as factory land. So by the early 1960s, you had a number of surfboard workshops that were concentrated together in a light industrial estate in Brookvale. And this becomes sort of known as factory land, if you like, producing huge volumes of surfboards each year. What we did was we actually got the opportunity to go and interview a lot of these sort of industry pioneers in Australia. So we interviewed people like Barry Bennett, Joe Larkin was another one, Gordon Woods. And they told us really fascinating stories about how they went about turning this hobby and DIY activity really into a livelihood, into a living. And it was often through quite informal networks. So in the case of Barry Bennett, he'll mention his Qantas engineer who helped in getting information on how to manufacture foam blanks. So the transition from balsa wood to foam blanks was actually really significant because it again reduced the labour intensiveness of board making, so that it meant that more boards could potentially be made in a shorter amount of time. And so Barry told a really great story about his early experimentation with producing foam and the real significant difficulties that he had with that. It was a lot of trial and error. No one really knew much about how much of the ingredients to add. It was a bit of this and a bit of that. And obviously you can probably imagine that things went wrong with quite volatile, toxic materials. So Joe Larkin, who actually worked for Barry Bennett, and a photograph here of Joe's workshop in Kira Beach from 1968. But basically Joe tells the same sort of story that Barry told in the previous slide, but gives a bit more detail about nearly blowing up Barry's parents' home when the moulds that we used to cast the foam would often give way because of the expansion properties of foam. And at one stage there, they actually blew out the half of Barry Bennett's parents' home. So this sort of informality, I guess, is where the industry's come from. And as it turns out, it's quite important to think about that history and that informal culture around which this industry developed, because it actually even still lingers within the contemporary industry in a lot of ways as well. Some other photographs, this one's quite significant. Gordon Merchant here, the founder of Billabong, who actually worked as a sander for Scott Dillon for a number of years. So Scott Dillon's factory, 20 years, actually almost 20 years after it started, but quite significant. And one of the really interesting things that happens as surfboard making evolves and as designs change, the sort of conventional history of surfing often depicts changes in design and innovations as being quite isolated to one or two individuals, often Californians or Australian surfers. But what our research found was that a lot of the time it was actually very strong and close collaborations that were occurring between Australian board makers or Californian board makers and Hawaiians, and particularly Hawaiian surfers that were in some ways much more advanced in the 1950s and 1960s than their Western counterparts, and had significant influence on the design and the making of surfboards actually well into the 1970s. So I guess a question to win a book again, can someone tell me who these two identities, quite well-known surfing identities are? Hawaiian here, and so someone's got one already. This is Greg Knoll, famous American surfer and also board maker, and an example of a very close collaboration with a Hawaiian surfer and board maker too. Richard will get this. You might have to give the story away, Richard. Ben Iper. That's correct. It's in the post. It's in the post, Richard. The book. Absolutely, yes. So it's quite. That's okay. So it's quite cyclical, but this is it's quite an iconic photograph actually, because it does show that throughout this era, the late 60s to early 1970s, as things within surfboard making were starting to change, that there was this interesting collaboration going on actually between Californian and Australian surfers. In this case, another example of a collaboration between Mark Richards and Ben Iper. Ben Iper actually showed Mark how to shape a certain style of surfboard in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and an extract from a letter that Mark Richards had actually wrote to Ben Iper thanking him for the sharing of knowledge and skill that he'd passed on to Mark. And so these sort of things that we dug up in our research sort of challenged the common notions of how surfboard design evolved, and it actually wasn't really in isolation, but in many cases was in quite close collaboration with other people, particularly Hawaiian surfers and Hawaiian waves. Another example, I guess, in terms of a well-known Australian board maker, Jeff McCoy, talking here a little bit about the Hawaiian shapers and how they influenced him. Again, this just sort of neatly illustrates the very collaborative and sharing nature of that era, I guess. And a photograph here of me with Dick Brewer became very well known for shaping boards suited to very big waves, and actually how Dick Brewer came to be involved in making surfboards himself was through a relationship that he had with a Hawaiian named Buffalo Kealana, who was a well-known Hawaiian big wave surfer, who actually saw a competitor on a Dick Brewer made board, really liked the way that it worked, and then essentially started asking Dick to make him boards, and then all of a sudden within Hawaiian surfing scene, many other people started demanding Dick make boards for them too, and so that was essentially the jumping off point for Dick in terms of starting his own business. But I think I've probably spoken for long enough, and I think it's probably a good jumping point into sharing conversation with the audience. So I'll leave it with this slide, which is basically a point I wanted to make about how within surfboard making scenes there's many different theories and opinions on what makes a good surfboard. There's often surfers will go searching for what they see as constituting a magic board, and that's something that I often asked a lot of board makers themselves. What is a magic surfboard? And I found that a lot of them actually had very different answers. Some said that it was something that really sort of never existed, that there was no one board that would ever be the same, would work differently depending on who the surfer and customer was. So that whole idea of a magic board would be something that would be individual to all of us. We all might use the same board and each of us would have a different feeling and reaction to that particular product. So just, I guess, some sketches here that in a conversation with a board maker, Jeff McCoy, that I had, he tried to run me through his particular theory on what made a good surfboard and how a good surfboard had to work in close relationship with the natural environment, which I think is something that actually was a common thread that ran through many of the stories that I heard from board makers themselves. A very important relationship that had to be forged in understanding how waves and how the energy of waves impacted on things like surfboard design. Do we want to play the video? Yeah. We have a video, I guess, that we made from a recent research trip that we took to the Gold Coast to help promote the book. It sort of tells a little bit more about the story, but it also lets you hear some of the stories from board makers themselves. So it's probably a good idea to play that clip, and after that we might take some questions, I think. Yeah, the future of the industry, true.
As an academic, I'm interested in how particular industries grow and evolve in particular places. And in my background, I've done work on things like the music industry and on festivals and events that have got a really strong connection to local culture in one way or another. And then along came this PhD student I had who grew up locally here in the Illawarra, who was a surfer, and who put to me the preposterous idea that that he should write a PhD on surfboard making.
So my PhD was basically a study of surfboard manufacturing, how the industry worked, where it was located.
I really encouraged Andrew to explore the surfboard making industry initially here in the Illawarra and then further up and down the Australian coast to look at how it was connected to local culture and to local places.
So the book was basically about wanting to understand what we saw as being a fairly unique creative industry. For me, it was about understanding a sort of little known form of manufacturing that I saw as being an iconic Australian industry. So I wanted to sort of document that. But it was also about wanting then to understand this group of workers as surfboard makers and how they'd carved out a living doing something that they loved.
But when there were no waves, I'd go in the factory and I'd go, what can I do? And in those days, the blanks were super thick and really needed a lot of work done on them. So he'd go, oh, you can cut plan shapes.
And I met up with a guy who taught me actually how to make surfboards. But he was really lazy, and so he'd swing in a hammock and use his index finger, and I'd be in there shaping, and he wouldn't get out of the hammock, and he'd show me how to glass. He'd just point the fingers, and I'd do things, right?
Just spending lots of hours in the shaping bay, and found it very fascinating to watch him be able to manufacture something with his hands, make something with his hands, and it come out exactly to what he said it would go like.
Started shaping boards, I suppose, like most people, because you're just curious and interested. Started out just mucking around in a friend's backyard and made some good stuff, made some absolutely terrible stuff.
But I liked the knowledge and the technicality of design and how the little tiny things are magnified under pressure.
Working with the guys at Gordon & Smith, going through the whole factory from broomstick to right the way through, taught me how to use tools individually.
I just think there's something nice about working with your hands.
People were saying, why don't you start your own business? And I didn't really know what to do. So first week we did about 9 boards, the second week was about 20, and then all of a sudden we were doing 65 boards a week within a month.
71 I started, I think. At that stage, most people were buying surfboards out of the factory. They'd go to the factory and get one made. Custom surfboards were the big thing.
Now there's machines. Any board can be copied. It can be put on the machine can do 90% of that intuitive work. And then they come out and we call them scrapers. They just finish it off, give it to the customer.
I think there's a lot of guys out there making boards, and a lot of guys that have got a really big reputation now, that are really moving up in the industry, that probably have never picked up a planer.
Hand shaping will never be able to create the volume of surfboards needed for the amount of surfers that there are today.
I've gone from making lots of stock boards through pot surfboards and then trying to maintain that high stock level to supply shops to going, well, that's not what I want to do anymore. I want to deal directly with the customer and just deal with one customer at a time.
I definitely don't think hand shaping's dead. I think in the mass market, for sure.
The shaping machines have made a big difference. They got a lot of bad flack in the beginning. People, oh, they're pop outs and this and that, but they actually make designing surfboards more accurate. You can repeat a board that's successful quite easily. You can do everything you can do. But the hand shaping thing, yes, it was a great skill, a great art, but if you don't need to do it, why do you do it?
I think the industry went so far one way with just this mass-produced stuff, where it's so disconnected from the customer, that people are actually almost shifting back a little.
There's a bit of room for everybody, and last thing I'd want here is to be hand shaping 20 boards a week and then going to glass 20 boards a week. I'd never get out of the factory. So I think small personalised shaping businesses is how I see my connection, and how anybody else wants to do it. I go, hey, sweet, go for it. That's their world, and if they're happy in their world, fantastic.
So that was... It's probably actually a very good segue into introducing Richard Harvey, who finished off that video so eloquently. So did Richard want to come up and join me. So I guess I'll just say a few words about Richard. So Richard was someone who I actually talked fairly early in the process with and went up to meet. Australian surfing champion in 1973 at Margaret River, so defeated Michael Peterson in that contest. If anyone's interested in seeing some footage of Richard surf, quite big, double overhead, would you say, Richard, Margaret River?
Yeah,
it's pretty big. It's actually on YouTube, so if you type in Richard's name into Google, you'll have some fantastic 2 or 3 minute footage. Richard, I don't think you
Haven't seen it, no.
You should see it. It's fantastic, fantastic footage of Richard in very big waves. So I guess I just would like to ask if you could share with the audience really how you came about making surfboards for a living.
Terrific. Thanks very much for having me down here. Actually, I really appreciated reading the book, and it really compiles all the information that I knew and grew up with, right from all of those early manufacturers right through up until today, and put it in print. And I think it's terrific that we write these things down, documents the Australian history and the Australian surfing history, which gives us all a bit of heritage and lets us know what the real things are. So for me, when I see the photos of Scott Dillon working on balsa boards, that's where I started. And I came in on boards that were very straight. About 1958 was when I first started surfing. And by about 1960, I had a foam surfboard that I'd bought from one of the local hot surfers at the time, and it got a ding in the nose, and the ding got bigger and bigger and bigger until it was about so big. And I went, I can't just have a big hole in the end of my surfboard, so I mashed up a whole pile of newspaper and made some paper mache and covered it over with a masking tape, and that was my first ding repair. It doesn't seem like much at this stage, but Brookvale was probably, from where I lived at Mona Vale, was probably about maybe half an hour on a double-decker bus with a 9-foot surfboard, so it was totally impractical to take my surfboard there to get repaired. So I made these things myself. As the deterioration of the front of that surfboard continued, I ended up getting one of those big long hand saws that was about this long, and it was one of my dad's old ones. It was all rusty, and I proceeded to cut the front foot off the surfboard, which gave it a very square, odd look. And I went, oh, that doesn't look right. So I cut the corners off, and then I ended up putting some fiberglass over the top of it, which I'd got from a local boat shed, and it went purple. I think I had too much promoter or catalyst in it, and so that was my very first surfboard. But it ended up being an 8-footer, and everybody else was riding 9'6". So I guess in a way it was the beginning of a shortboard and a shaping career for me. Not a real successful one. That surfboard got a reputation by its name. It was called the Ugly. That ugly surfboard got me a 3rd place in the New South Wales Junior State title, and the statement was the turns, they just kept on coming. So from that beginning, probably more of a mistake than anything else, was my real introduction into the surfboard industry. As it went on, my surfing ability got better and better, and as it was documented in that little video about going into the shaping bay when there was no waves around, and they just get me to cut things out and plane foam off, and gradually it got sort of more and more elaborate, and I ended up having a model, which I think I got paid maybe a pound for every board that had my name on it, which was quite a bit, because as a 15-year-old I was earning £5 a week at my previous job, so that was quite good. And then one of the guys said, when I got my licence, he said, I'm going to give you a car. And I went, oh, that's pretty good. It was an old FJ Ute, painted bright orange with my manufacturer's surfboard name on it, on the end of it. And he said, that's all you're going to get, and you can just go surfing wherever you want and I'll pay the bill. So I'd travel up and down the coast surfing with all different sorts of people and learning what surfboard design was all about. So by about 1969, 1970, I ended up moving to the Gold Coast. We were chasing longer waves, we were chasing faster, hollower, more exotic point, warm water. That's why I'm wearing my jacket tonight. It's freezing down here. I don't know about you guys, but coming from the tropics. So as we started to surf all of these different waves, our surfboard started to change, and it was just a natural evolution about surfboard design. And rather than having to go to somebody to do it, I was going, I'll go back and I just need to take a bit more area out of the tail, or a bit more curve in the front, or we played around with fins, we played around with plan shapes, we played around with length, and obviously we played around with colours and all the other bits and pieces that go along with it as well. When I was first travelling as a surfer, it used to take me about 2 days to drive from Sydney to Queensland. Now in 2 days we can travel to anywhere in the world. We can be in exotic destinations in the Mentawais, off Sumatra. We can be over on big wave breaks in the Atlantic Ocean within 2 days. So now the travel has really allowed us to experience a lot of different things in surfboard designs. And over the last 20 years, we've really got to understand what the dynamics are that make surfboards work. It's the dynamics that really create the feeling of the surfboard. And I was having a chat with Julie, one of your professors, earlier on, and I was explaining how when we start surfing, we're a board rider. And as a shaper, that's exactly what I do. I shape surfboards. But as a board rider, you stand on the board and you ride the board straight in towards the beach. As you progress in your surfing, you become a wave rider. And the wave becomes the essential item as what surfers really look for. We're out there and we're looking at the ocean, and we're looking out the front to see if there's any surfboards on the beach. We're looking to see if there's any waves on the beach. So the waves are the predominant thing, and as a shaper, the whole goal of what I try to achieve is trying to match up the surfer, their fitness, their ability, their weight, their approach, whether they're passive, whether they're aggressive in their surfing approach, and also the style that they like, and match that up to the wave. And then I build this surfboard that fits in the middle. The better I can build that surfboard to match the surfer and the wave, the more that surfboard disappears. And as Chris was saying earlier about shapers trying to discover the magic surfboard is the one that disappears. It's the magician that makes it disappear because he's matched the surfer and the wave together. That particular skill takes years and years and years of, I guess, being a bit of an amateur psychologist, dealing with people. It becomes an area where you have to deal in structure and logic and measurements, and also you have to deal in the creative side of imagination and all of those. So we use the whole spectrum of our mind, our physical abilities, and then we try to come up with this surfboard that disappears when you get it right. That's the magic surfboard. I guess in a way it's matching up the surfer, the wave, with a piece of equipment that is so suited to what all the elements are all about, that the rider doesn't have to think about the equipment he's standing on. All he thinks about is where his head projects where he wants to go. Now, we're also talking about earlier that if I had 10 components that I could put together in all these different ways, I'd end up with 10 times 10 times 10. So I'd end up with a number with 10 noughts after it, which you can imagine that's in the trillions, I guess. In surfboards, there's probably about 65 major components that go into building a surfboard. So if you can imagine 65 multiplied by 65 times, that number is about how many variables there could possibly be just as a basic in surfboard design. That's why we'll never get two surfboards that'll feel the same. Even if they've come off a machine, the wood might have been grown and harvested in one part of the world, another part of the world. The foam would have been blown on a warm day or a cold day with a different formula. the tiniest little things that we put into surfboards make the biggest difference. When I do a workshop and I teach people how to shape surfboards, we talk about all the little things that make a big difference. And one of the examples I use is I put a piece of string about 1 millimetre high and I tape it across a surfboard, and I've got a fire hose out the front, and I turn it on sort of not too hard, and the water trickles down, hits that little piece of string and bubbles over it and keeps going. But as I turn the pressure up on that piece of string, the water comes down and sheets across that surfboard and hits that little 1 millimetre high piece of string and bounces into the air and actually ends up bouncing right off the end of the surfboard. So that little tiny 1 millimetre piece of string with the water that hits it is magnified to such a degree that it changes the whole concept of what a surfboard is all about. And that's the degree that shapers work in. We shape in all of these little tiny degrees of changes in surfboards to try to chase the magic surfboard. And every shaper has their own little formula. I have a series of formulas that I teach about. People come in and go, oh, the surfboard I can paddle out okay, but I can't catch waves on it. So it's not buoyancy that's an issue, it's a dynamic that's underneath the chest of where it paddles. Dick Brewer became famous, and one of Dick's famous contributions to surfboard design was for big waves, and he could build wave boards that would catch Waimea waves, really big 25, 30 foot waves. And he used to say that he'd build a section underneath the body in the surfboard that was like a big flat planing section. So over the years we've come to understand the components that go into making a surfboard. And it's not just what we've discovered in the last few years, it's been the whole history that Chris and Andrew have actually written about in the book, about all of these manufacturers, what they've actually contributed to, and they're the ones that have pioneered the way. It's easy for me to come in and go, oh yes, I'm using leg ropes, or I'm using travel to go to different places like the Mentawis or Samoa or wherever, but it's these guys that pioneered the industry that have really led the way to us discovering all these things that sort of make it work now.
Excellent. So I guess can we thank Richard for... In the interest of time, I guess it's probably good to throw it out to the audience. I'm sure that many of you have probably got questions of Richard or of us in terms of the book, so we thought we would maybe ask the audience to ask us questions. Is there anyone that wanted to kick things off?
Come on, John, you can do it.
Yep, there's one.
So, are you happy with your surfing now? Like, do you want to get better?
Always want to get better, always. We were talking earlier and saying how that the addiction of surfing is when you get a really good wave and you just want to paddle out and get another one. Well, one of the guys was saying earlier, that's what it is with surfing. You just want to go out and catch another one. The reason we want to catch another one is what we do as surfers. When you're sitting out in the ocean and a swell comes through, the water just goes up and down. It doesn't move towards the beach, so the water is just going up and down. What's moving towards the beach is the energy. The energy that's created to make that wave. It starts off from tides and wind, currents that are generated that move around the planet, the turning of the planet, and what it is as a surfer, and why surfing becomes so addictive, and it has for me for my 55 years of surfing, is that I've hooked onto the energy of the universe. And that's the thing that just gives me goosebumps even today, that I never want to give that up. It's like an addiction that I've just going, it's the best addiction in the world, and every time I go surfing I just want to go and get another one and another one and get another one. So to answer your question, I'll never give it up. I mean, I haven't got the physical fitness that I had when I was in my 20s, but I'm still getting the physical or the mental enjoyment and the stimulation out of it. And surfing, and I know for everybody that surfs, it's exactly the same way. You get a good one and it changes your world. When you give somebody a good surfboard, it changes their world. They don't come home and yell at the missus and kick the cat. Life's wonderful. You know, there's no complaints with life. Life's just fantastic. So
Thank you.
Always want another one.
So I'm glad to hear that you're still enjoying your surfing. But when you when you're out there with umpteen other people trying to catch the same waves, are you ever sorry that people of your generation actually popularised this sport?
That's a good question.
Yes. I surfed Bali in the early 70s, and I paddled from Illawarra 2 right down through all the different points right back to Byron Bay. And I came back in and I told a bunch of the guys that I was with, I said, I paddled past all of these incredible points. And they went, where are they? And I went, well, that one was sort of out about halfway out there. And so the next year when I came back, I took a couple of guys down there, and they were movie makers. And they were a friend of mine, Dick Hoole, who made Tubular Swells, another guy that made a movie called Free Ride, California movie with Sean Thompson and some really good footage. And they filmed it all, and there was only ever 3 or 4 of us in the water, and we never thought about what surfing would ever become. Just like as I never thought when I started surfing, I'd won in, I think it was about 1974, Australia's richest surfing contest, and it was $1,000. And I think, wow, that was just so much money. And I look at them now with $1 million contracts, $1 million homes, and no one ever can predict the future. But the other thing is all those people that are surfing down through Padang and getting such a big thrill out of surfing that I got, that if you had something so good, you'd want to share it with somebody. And I guess it's human nature that some people are going to be really good about it and other people are going to be a bit aggro and a bit sort of, doesn't matter what you share with people. Some people get good out of it and some people don't get anything really good out of it. I surf on the Gold Coast. When the Quickie Pro is on up there, we probably have a break that runs from the back of Snapper through to Kirra. There could be anywhere up to 600 people in the water, which is staggering. But other days, you just might find a little break all by yourself and you just go, that's what surfing's all about. These days I travel, I get away a bit. I've got a friend who's got a boat and we go off and sort of discover nice little waves all to ourselves. And I guess for me, I'm not surfing every day of the week, so I'm just enjoying the days that I get. But I think if you share waves with your mates, it's a great experience. We've just got to be careful in a day when there's a lot of people around that we just don't get too greedy or get a bigger board and sit outside and catch too many waves. We've just got to learn to share.
Or a stand-up paddleboard, for example.
You know, the thing that I guess I see that people that miss out, as I was explaining before about the sensitivity that comes through your feet when you're surfing, you're feeling all that energy. As soon as you put straps and paddles and sails and kites and all of these different things, you miss out what it is that we're really connecting to as a surfer. We're connecting to the energy of the universe through the sensitivity of our feet. And if we have that, you don't need very much to get you happy. So I think people on all different sorts of equipment have to recognise that they're out there to enjoy themselves, and if we all just give a little bit and, you know, we'll get a little bit and the world will be a lovely place. I'm dreaming, aren't I?
Thank you.
So you talked about the history of surfboard manufacturing. Can you give us any insights into the future of surfboard manufacturing in Australia and around the world?
Technology is leading us into some great new areas. One of them is the shaping machine, and obviously there's no way there are enough shapers around to be able to create the volume of surfboards that are needed by the people that are surfing. The future of surfboard design will grow according to the ability of surfers, the materials that are available, carbons. Back in 1954, I think it was, the American spies stole a foam formula from the Germans during the Second World War, and foam became introduced as an insulation material, and then eventually it overtook balsa as an insulation material, and foam was a big change in materials. We're dealing now with chemicals, we're dealing with materials like carbons and epoxies. There's a lot of misinformation going out because a lot of it's glamorised to say that certain materials will do certain things. But I think in essence, the key with surfboards is that if we still maintain the feeling through our feet and the connection to what the ocean's giving us, there will still be a value in surfing. To give you an example, polystyrene is what a lot of boards are made of. There's a Robert August model over there that's veneered over the outside. It's polystyrene core as compared to polyurethane. Polystyrene is actually pellets that are sort of welded together. Foam is the absolute opposite. It's a hollow core with a wall. What happens when you surf polystyrene is that the polystyrene muffles the energy. It's like dancing in gumboots is what I call it. Whereas foam, with the hollow cell and the wall, the energy comes up through and you get it through your feet. So there's two different feelings that you get through the materials. The advantage of the lightweight polystyrene is that it needs to be glassed with epoxy, which is really a hard, strong resin. So boards are light, they paddle really easily, they're not prone to damage, so they're ideal for people that are in the entry level in surfing. So every little bit has its advantage. Stand-up paddle boards have got people interested in the ocean. People are becoming conscious of the ocean. I noticed one of your professors that I was talking to early was talking about the ocean and the environment, and we were talking about the coal and the coke and the steel, or the ships that are sitting out to sea, and there's a greater demand on the ocean. We're just on the fringe along the little whitewater strip that's along the edge, but people are becoming aware of the ocean, and it's through the use of all these new modern technologies that it make it easier for people to pick up a stand-up paddleboard. If I was to make them out of foam, really heavy, but made out of that new material, it allows people to enjoy the ocean and become conscious that we need to protect the ocean, we need to protect the environment, the local environment, and it's all a part of what modern technology can be. Where it goes in the future, if I'd known, I would have bought shares in Billabong a long while ago. And I mean, I think the key is it doesn't matter how much money you've got, it's whether you're enjoying your life or not. And if you're enjoying your life, you can be just someone sitting on the beach and coconut tree above them and making life really simple. But technology's there, it's there to be used. It can be used in the right way, it can be used in the wrong way, and it all boils down to the people that are using it and their attitude and their approach. So it's all about the people, I guess. Surfboards are all about the people and the waves we ride. The environment is about what we can do to protect it. And hopefully we learn from all the lessons that are being written down in the books, and give us all a chance to read some of the things that have gone on previously. So hopefully we don't make mistakes and we learn from our elders, and hopefully we pass on a little bit of that information to the young people coming through so they learn and respect it as well.